All right, here we are again. Now we're going to continue. Just as a side note, I listened to my recording of the steps 1, 2, and 3. It was kind of humiliating to hear how many ums and ahs I had, but oh my God, we'll never get through this if I try to get it perfect. So let's just move on. Database APIs. Let's talk a little bit about them. Your PHP pages, we saw this diagram in the last video, and the database's API. Remember, API is Application Programming Interface. The API's got the job of communicating with the database in some kind of measure. So what we have to do is we have to learn how to work with a database API. But just before we get there, I should say a little bit about something called SQL Lite, which we will actually make use of. SQL Lite is kind of an interesting API. Unlike MySQL, which is a full database management system, SQL Lite is just it's file-based. There's no other software that we need to run. So we'll try to make use of a little bit of both. And when you compare this to the remember here where the database management system was MySQL, right? And the database API had to interact with this other piece of software. With SQL Lite is just a file, and the API, in a sense, manages getting the requests for the data and so on. It's kind of a nice way of working because it doesn't require all this other setup. So we'll probably make use of both, though right now the lab Chapter 14, Lab 14, is just MySQL based. We will maybe occasionally use SQLite. At any rate, when we talk about MySQL, there's typically three kind of approaches. There's this thing called the MySQL extension. There's this thing called the MySQLi extension. And then there's this stuff called PHP data objects, or just generally PDO. These are older approaches to working with databases in PHP. PDO is probably the current way. It's actually been around since the first edition of the book, so it's almost 8 or 9, 10 years old now. It's an abstraction layer, which means that it's been designed to work with other databases, not just MySQL. And indeed, we'll look at how we can use PDO to communicate with the SQLite database, for instance. But because it is an abstraction layer, it might not be able to make use of all the features of MySQL. That's not going to be a problem for us, however. I should warn you to be a little wary of online PHP help, right? So let's say you go off and you're having some problem, and you'll do what every student seems to do. They go to Stack Overflow, and of course, how do Google links work? Well, the things that have the most links to them end up at the top of the search results. Old answers are much more likely to show up at the top of your Google search results. So here's a real example. I went and just did a simple search. This showed up, I think, number 2 in my search engine results, but take a look. It's 10 years old. So someone's asking, well, how do I connect my MySQL database in PHP? And the top answer, you can see is, well, it's showing MySQLi, which again is quite ancient and not really the best way. So be careful when you go and try to copy and paste code from Stack Overflow. I hope that doesn't become the way you need to work, but it's possible. Do take a look and see how old it is. Make sure you don't try to make use of one of these older ways of working. So, as I mentioned, while PDO might not be able to take advantage of some new features of MySQL, there's a lot to be said for making use of PDO because it does allow you to write your code in a kind of database independent way. Databases change, right? You might make use of, I don't know, SQLite at one point, then switch to MySQL, and then maybe switch to a cloud-based one. Like, there's often databases change, or the one that you use in a web context changes. So there's, I would recommend sticking with the database independent PDO approach. That's certainly the way the labs are set up and the way the rest of this lecture is. So before we actually start doing some coding, let's say a few words about managing a MySQL database. You can make use of a command line interface. I think for the students who've taken Database 1 here at our university, this is the way you probably are already familiar with using MySQL. In a PHP context, there's this really lovely browser-based administrative panel called PHP MyAdmin. It allows you to do pretty much almost any task that you would do in the command line, creating tables, inserting data, running SQL queries, whatever you think of, setting up security. You can do all of that directly within this PHP MyAdmin panel, so it's quite highly recommended. There's another tool provided by Oracle called, I think, MySQL Workbench. I quite like it as well. Rather than PHP admin, it just makes it a little bit easier to do certain kinds of tasks, but it requires you to download and install a piece of software. It's by no means necessary, but I just wanted to let you know that this was out there. All right, well, I get my very first try at making making one of these videos. I forgot to do the audio, which was kind of sad. I had some great jokes, but they disappeared into the ether. So I'm going to actually stop this video and do number 6 as a separate video.